this should be fun, shouldn't it? Woo! Can't wait. Something about sex. So many
time.
people here. Let's hope they all come back. I don't know if you've noticed, but we are a congregation of people with diverse sexualities and genders. In our beloved community, we've got people who are unashamedly gay, straight, bi, asexual, and everything in between. We're also a very gender diverse congregation, and gender also plays into sexuality. We've got people who are married, people who are single, in long-term relationships. We've got people who've had a series of relationships, people who have never had sex, people who are having a lot of sex. I confess that I've never actually had to think very deeply about sexual ethics. I'm a straight woman. I've been married to the same man for 32 years. And why would I want to rent a Corolla when I've got a BMW in Carolina? So it's my lived experience. And until I found myself at MCC, I hadn't really thought too deeply about anyone else's lived experience. But here I am now, been here for like 7 months or something, haven't I? Woo. And I kind of feel like my ideas about sex and sexual ethics have been thrown up in the air like a deck of cards, and they're all still sort of up there, and I'm really not quite sure where they're going to land. I suspect, though, that there are people here who have thought much more deeply and for longer than I have about sexual ethics. And that's actually my first and most important point, that my voice up here is just one among many, and this sermon shouldn't be seen as some kind of final word or final answer, but rather I really hope that it might be the start of a conversation. Because I think it's a really important conversation. And I think that for a few reasons. Firstly, there's a bunch of passages about sex and sexual ethics in the middle of the Corinthian letter, as you've seen tonight. And we're in the middle of this series on Corinthians. Some of those verses have been used to shame and condemn people. And that's been personally damaging to many people in this congregation. You see, the difficulty is that for most people here, the Bible actually matters. If it didn't matter, then those verses wouldn't matter. They wouldn't have the power to wound if they didn't matter. But the burning question for many LGBTQ people of faith is, how can these verses be reconciled to my lived experience? It's an important question. And that question doesn't have a simple answer, but I'm hoping that this sermon and the one next week might at least be of some help. Secondly, the reason I think it's important is because as I've spoken to people, I've heard a vast array of regret around sexuality. I've heard regrets about what they did do and regrets about what they didn't do. And regrets around sexuality, let's face it, aren't limited to our rainbow community. If you know anything about purity culture, if that phrase means something to you, purity culture started in the 80s in American evangelicalism, and what it did is it distilled sexual ethics down to this very short list of do's and don'ts. Don't have sex before you're married, and actually don't even think about sex before you're married, because that's a sin too. After you're married, you must have sex anytime your spouse wants it, because if you don't, they will probably have an affair and it'll be your fault. You've probably heard something like that if you've grown up in church. But reducing something as complex as sexual ethics down to a checklist of do's and don'ts has caused all kinds of long-term damage to people. And purity culture has caused a lot of damage to people. And maybe you're one of them. The final reason why I think this conversation is important is because one of the things that 1 Corinthians has convinced me of, as well as science, and especially psychology, is that bodies matter. If you think that the body and the soul, the inner person and the outer person, are two separate things, then you might be able to convince yourself that what you do with your body doesn't matter. And that's the error that Greek philosophy made. I talked about that like a month ago. The body is bad, the spirit/soul is good. But the biblical understanding, which is increasingly backed up by science and psychology, is that the mind and the body, the inner person and the person that you see on the outside, are interdependent. And what happens to one impacts the other. Good food and exercise positively impacts mental health. That's just established fact. Nobody quite knows why they do, but they do. And sex is another one of those things that you can do with your body that deeply impacts your whole being. Our culture thinks of sex as no more really than a recreational activity. It's a bit like a rugby game. It's a great way to keep fit. It's a fun thing to do on the weekends. But as any rape victim or child sexual abuse victim will tell you, sex has a much more profound effect on a person than a rugby game. Because it has the power to create profound bonds of affection between people, but it also has the power to wound deeply. So today I want to move away from the checklist approach and explore this topic from a different angle. And just a heads up, it's going to be especially hard to avoid male-gendered language for God, and I'm not going to try. But I just wanted to acknowledge that while we use he, him pronouns for God often, and as our Bible does and a lot of our songs, that's not a claim that God is somehow biologically male. I mean, that's kind of obvious, really. And maybe we'll talk about that sometime. But anyway, back to sex. One of the most interesting places you can go in the Bible to see how sex is understood is the Song of Songs. And if you've never read the Song of Songs, it's a far cry from those Corinthian passages about sex. Let me read to you the first couple of verses. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your lovemaking is more delightful than wine. The fragrance of your oil is delightful. You're like the finest perfume. No wonder the young women adore you. Draw me after you, let us hurry. May the king bring me into his bedroom chambers. It's kind of smouldering stuff, isn't it? There's a whole 8 chapters of that, and that's just the beginning. The whole 8 chapters, they're full of this erotic imagery and sexual metaphors. There's no checklist of do's and don'ts in this extended poem. Instead, there's things like scenes of these two lovers having sex in the forest. Listen to this. The lush foliage is our canopy bed. Oh gosh, I didn't realise there was a child here. Let's talk about Psalm 23, shall we? Okay, getting back to sex in the forest. The lush foliage is our canopy bed. The cedars are the beams of our bedroom chamber. The pines are the rafters of our bedroom. A little bit later, the woman invites her lover to go out into the fields of wheat for a little afternoon delight. At one point, she runs through the streets at night. She's looking for her lover. She can't find him. When she finally finds him, she practically drags him back to her bedroom. What is this raunchy book doing in our Bible? Well, some of the church fathers, the early church fathers in the first few centuries, they had a real problem with this book, this blatant celebration of sexual love, and they insisted it was just an allegory about love between God and his people. In fact, Augustine is famous for interpreting the verse, "Your navel is a rounded bowl, may it never lack mixed wine," as a reference to the baptismal font. Side note, just in case you're interested, actually the translation navel may be incorrect. It's one of those words that only appears once, and so it's hard to figure out what it actually means in the Hebrew. But it's much more likely to be a much more interesting body part, and I'm just going to let that hang there, and if you want to go Google that, you do. Or you can check out the NET version, the NET version, on your phones, and just click on the little note there and get some much more information about that. But anyway, you can't read Song of Songs and seriously think it's not about sex. It absolutely is. It's about sexual passion between two people who are absolutely infatuated and fascinated by each other's bodies. There's no shame, there's no humiliation, there's no embarrassment anywhere in these 8 chapters. And that's something the church might have done a little bit better to emphasise over the last few decades. But still, why does a book about sex end up in our sacred scriptures? Well, in spite of taking his allegory to such ridiculous extremes, I think Augustine was onto something. The Jewish community, and remember it was their scriptures long before it was our scriptures, the Old Testament, the Jewish community has always seen Song of Songs as a picture of God, the lover, who cherished his people Israel in this close, intimate relationship. So it's not either or, it's both and. Song of Songs is a celebration of sexual love, and it is a portrayal of the relationship between God and his people. And those two things are deeply connected. Because all through the Old Testament, God is portrayed as Israel's lover. The whole story of the Old Testament is about God staying faithful to his people, even when his people are faithless in return. God is the spouse who shows fidelity while his people are running off after other gods and worshipping them, committing adultery by worshipping other gods. When we get to the New Testament, there's a shift to Christ now. So there's all this imagery of Christ being the bridegroom and the church being his bride. Listen to Paul in Ephesians 5 as he gives his advice to husbands and wives. In the same way, and it's got all this body language in it as well. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one has ever hated his own body, but he feeds it and takes care of it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. And then he quotes a Bible verse. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and will be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then he says, this mystery is great. What, the mystery about a man and wife becoming one flesh? No, he says, but I am actually speaking with reference to Christ and the church. That's what the mystery is. Now, I'm not sure how you feel about that. Being Christ's bride, having God as your lover. If you have a complicated relationship with sex, and let's face it, most people do, it might be a really disturbing idea that sexual intimacy exemplifies and kind of echoes the relationship between God and his people. You might feel really uncomfortable about that. Understandably. Freaks me out. But stay with me here, because there's a flip side. You've probably also heard it said that God is like a father, and that can be a real problem for people who don't have great relationships with their fathers. But you see, we've got it the wrong way around. It's not that God is like a father, it's that fathers should be like God, loving and protecting their children and sticking with their children even when their children mess up. And we can get the lover thing the wrong way around too. It's not that God is like a lover, it's that lovers should look to God to see what makes a great lover. Someone who cherishes their partner. Someone who loves and relishes intimacy. True love is being able to stand naked and unashamed in front of each other, delighted by what they see. And that's what God does. Just like the lovers in the Song of Songs. Now, just as terrible fathers are a reality, so are terrible lovers. People who abuse, who damage, who use and throw away, who take and don't give, who treat their sexual partners like a sex toy instead of a human being, instead of a person to be cherished. And just as God is the gold standard that parents can look to if they want to be great parents, so this picture in Song of Songs of God as a lover can be the ideal for lovers. Sex puts you in a really vulnerable position, physically and emotionally. And being vulnerable, that is a big risk to take. And it requires trust. So if you're in a sexual relationship, it is worth asking, does your partner have your back? Can you let yourself go and be vulnerable knowing that this person is trustworthy? Can you rely on them to have your best interests at heart? Is this a relationship where each person is protective of the other person's physical and emotional well-being? Is it a relationship that's of mutual benefit, mutual tenderness, mutual care? We're going to be talking about sex specifically in 1 Corinthians next week, just giving you a warning in case you want to stay away next week and watch online from the comfort of your own lounge rooms. But as I said before, 1 Corinthians is a letter about bodies. Paul says that our individual bodies are mysteriously part of the body of Christ. And that means that our decisions about our individual bodies invariably impact the body of Christ, the body of our congregation. Well, what does that mean? Well, it probably means a lot of things, but I think when it comes to sexuality, our congregation will show sensitivity and scope for a diversity of opinions and expressions. That's what we're known for. We need to have a strong stance towards human sexuality as being something to be celebrated rather than something that causes shame. It's a gift and not a curse. And you know what? We could lead the way in that amongst the churches. And we also need to have a strong stance against harm. Our congregation needs to be a safe place for relationship. What better place to find a partner, if that's what you're looking for, than here? But it will not be a safe place for harm or for behaviour that damages people. congregation should be rightly concerned about relationships that involve differentiations of power, about bullying, or people treating the congregation as a pool of short-term sexual prospects, because we're not a pool of short-term sexual prospects. We are a beloved community. We are beloved by God. So, each person has to find their own way in this. You're responsible for your own sexual ethics, your own sexual decisions, and you do not want to allow a preacher to stand behind a pulpit and tell you what you should do. That hasn't worked out particularly well for the church, I don't think. Use your own wisdom. Use your own reading of the Bible, your own understanding of yourself and your relationship with others, and your own understanding of God to figure out what your sexual ethics are. At the same time, as a collective body, we need to have each other's backs. We need to be looking out for each other, extending grace, and understanding that all of us are flawed and fallible, but we also need to stand against damage and harm and abuse. As I said, next week I'm going to talk about how we deal with passages about sex in 1 Corinthians more specifically, so strap yourself in for that one.